Hello, Iowa Realtors. We're back for another episode of Legal Breakdown. This time, another part of our series, Disclosure, Duties, and Dilemmas. So we got a topic for you today.
Unbelievable. Welcome back, everybody. Glad to have you back. Gabe, we're going to talk about the issue of stigmas.
Stigmas. This one, as somebody who answers a lot of questions on the legal hotline, this one comes in. When we're talking about stigmas, what are we talking about?
We're talking about things that impact someone's desirability to buy the house. The types of stigmas I'm thinking about would be things such as a murder-suicide stigma, a phenomena stigma.
Yep.
There's a ghost in the house.
Yep. Yeah. And it could just be a more simple death in the home. There's all kinds of things that people might talk about, whether there's a disclosure obligation, okay?
Yeah.
And some states do have specific stigma laws, don't they?
They do, Gabe, but my research tells me that Iowa does not have a stigma statute. Now, that can be good and it can be bad. And I'm going to tell you why I say that. I say it can be good for the realtors because it's one less statute, one less regulation they need to worry about.
Right.
On the other hand, what it does is it puts this duty of disclosure on the realtor.
It does.
And now the realtor has to make these difficult decisions.
Yeah.
Do I disclose? Do I not disclose? When? Where? How?
And this truly, duties and dilemmas, right? We're going to talk about their duties, but dilemmas, right? Because on one side of it, it's like, man, I don't want to put my client in a bad position if I don't have any obligation to disclose this. On the other, boy, what if somebody finds I do have a duty of disclosure, right? It can be tough.
Yeah, and you mentioned the client.
Yeah.
The client really drives a lot of the agent's obligation to disclose. And there's going to be times when there's going to be a dilemma between the agent and the client.
Yep.
Client says don't disclose. Agent says I feel I should disclose. Agent says I don't want to disclose. Client says disclose, back and forth.
And the good news, though, is I would say generally if the client's on board with disclosing, even if it's maybe not required, they can make that decision, right?
Exactly. I would agree. I think if the client says disclose and the realtor says don't disclose, there could be an issue there.
Yes, absolutely. Where I think we need to think about this conversation, right, is we know that realtors have a duty to disclose to everyone in a transaction any material adverse facts, right? What is a material adverse fact?
Material adverse fact means an adverse fact that a party indicates is of such significance or that it is generally recognized by a competent licensee as being of such significance to a reasonable party that it affects or would affect the party's decision to enter into a contract or agreement concerning a transaction or affects or would affect the party's decision about the terms of the contract or agreement.
So either the party says it's important to them, right? That makes it easy, or that's recognized by, a competent licensee as generally of being of such significance, right? So what does that mean? Because the code section goes on to say what is an adverse fact? Something that either significantly or adversely affects the value of the property, something that significantly reduces structural integrity, or presenting a significant health risk, right? Those last two, if we're talking about a previous death in the home, not an issue. The only thing it could be is, does this affect, one, a party's willingness to want to enter into the contract, but then also it has to affect the value of the property. Would a death in the home affect the value of the property?
Yeah, and I think that's the key, right? And that's something that it's an objective standard, if you will. What it might affect my desirability to buy the property or what I'm willing to pay for it might not affect someone else.
Do you think if we had 10 people in a room and asked them that question, we'd get answers all over the board?
All over the board, Gabe, all over the board. And that's the key to this is we have to understand the basics. And that would dictate, I think, give us guidance on what to disclose.
But we can't stop there, right? We just talked about what's a material adverse fact, right? And you have to disclose material adverse facts. But the code says you don't have to disclose a few material adverse facts, right? You do not have to disclose a material adverse fact the party already knows about, right? That makes sense. You don't have to disclose to the other party a material adverse fact that the party could discover through a reasonably diligent inspection and which would be discovered by a reasonably prudent person under like or similar circumstances, right? If everybody knows about it, if it's all over the newspapers, if it's all over the internet, you could see somebody making an argument maybe that they could discover that, right?
Right.
Material adverse facts, disclosure prohibited by law, or material adverse facts that are known by a person who conducts an inspection on behalf of the property. So This is tough.
It is tough, Gabe, and I'm a big advocate of disclosure.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to go back to what I've always said, and that's disclose, disclose, disclose. If you have a dilemma or an issue with your client, educate your client, talk to them, tell them the importance of disclosure. What I don't like to see is someone not disclose, and before they know it, the new buyer's going to find out. The neighbor's going to tell them, right? The neighbor's going to tell them. And now that agent is subject to maybe some civil liability, maybe an ethical violation. Let's avoid that.
Yeah.
Let's just disclose that. Best practices, in my opinion.
And again, I think it's so important to have these conversations with your client if you know this is going to be an issue right at the beginning, right? Have a game plan for how you're going to handle this so you're not guessing at the last minute.
Right. And there may come a situation, Gabe, where you feel it's best to disclose and your client says no, your seller client says no. You may not take that listing.
Yeah.
You may not want to take that listing for that reason.
Yeah. Because again, unfortunately, other states, it's very clear. If there's a stigmatizing condition, you have to disclose it. We don't have anything like that in Iowa. This is what you have. You have to make some decisions, and that's just part of this business.
Yep. Gabe, one case I want to do
Yes.
briefly a review with you. And this was not an Iowa case, it was not a state case, but it involved a murder occurring in a property, and that was not disclosed to the buyer.
Okay.
There was no requirement of disclosure.
Okay.
The buyer moved in, found out that a family had been murdered in there, and sued the seller, sued the listing agent for failure to disclose. The court found in favor of that plaintiff.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And the court deemed it a psychological issue.
Okay.
That it affected this plaintiff psychologically.
Okay.
And as such, the plaintiff was awarded some damages. So
Again,
thought I'd throw that out
yeah,
there.
in states, I'm sure, handle this issue very differently. Of course, it's good to know what other jurisdictions are doing. Those decisions aren't necessarily binding on Iowa courts, but at the same time, it's good to see how other jurisdictions handle these as well.
And the question I asked myself, Gabe, or I would ask myself, is it something that I would want to know?
Yeah.
If it's something I would want to know, then I would feel an obligation to disclose.
Absolutely. Well, George, it's been a great discussion.
Great discussion, and that's just the seeding of it. That's just the beginning of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.